Hello, listener. So this week, our king, yes, the Netherlands is still a monarchy for those of you who don't know, has apologized for Dutch violence in Indonesia, our former colony, during the independence war, police actions, depending on who you ask. But post World War II, there was some pretty hefty fighting against decolonization, and the king has apologized. Now, I'm not a supporter of colonialism necessarily. I think it was pretty much a mistake to colonize other peoples because, in the end, if you do an economic analysis, we could pretty much probably have gained as much resources and money from these colonies from free trade as from colonizing them. In fact, for many colonial powers, a lot of their colonies were netto losses. They didn't profit from them, especially British colonies in Africa were were not revenue generators but net losses, and it actually cost money to maintain them. Even British India wasn't as profitable as was often said, and Indonesia is in Dutch popular culture often presented as the engine on which we built the modern Netherlands, which of course isn't really true because the Industrial Revolution is what built the modern world, and it has a lot to do with simply the innate skill of people. And if you contrast and compare, for example, countries that didn't have colonies like Germany, well, Germany became pretty much the biggest industrial power by 1900, and it never had any colonies. It just had a very large native population. Anyway, my family has some ties to Indonesia because my grandfather served in the Dutch colonial army. So I'm going to just give a little brief overview of the Dutch Indies, Nederlands-Indië, as we used to call it, also known as the Gordel van Smaragd, the Emerald Belt, because of the series of green verdant isles. It's a very fertile area, Indonesia, especially the islands like Java, Borneo, Aceh, Sumatra. I'm just going to give a brief overview, but I'm mainly going to talk about here is the Second World War, decolonization wars, and the post-war period, which is relevant to what the king has apologized for. So, the first European colonization of the later Indonesia was by the Portuguese in 1519. At the time, there was no such thing as Indonesia. It was all sorts of small island nations, some more developed, some were simply tribal societies. There were a few Muslim sultanates, but the Portuguese basically established a trade post in what would later become Jakarta, and under Dutch rule would become Batavia-stad. The Dutch East India Company took Batavia-stad in 1595, and from then on until 1800, Indonesia was administered as a direct subject of the Dutch East India Company. VOC, Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie. This is similar to how a lot of colonial empires started. India was first colonized not by the British Crown but by the British East India Company, as were for example many of the French colonies in the Caribbean by French trade companies, not by the Crown. Only by the 19th century did the Crown take direct control. So control over Indonesia was always pretty tenuous. There was only really direct European rule in coastal cities, the trade towns, and for the rest, control was maintained through dealing with regional and local power, so lords, sultans, tribal elders, and so on, which basically had a sort of vassalage agreement where they would pay dues in return for trade and so on. This was basically how colonialism was run throughout Africa and Asia up until the 1880s or so, in the scramble for Africa. Portuguese colonialism up until 1880, for example, there was genuinely hardly any control over the interior of Mozambique or Angola or Guinea. They only had really control over the coastal cities, and they traded with the hinterland. This is pretty much similar to how French, British, and German colonies in Africa were run. up until the 1880s. And from the 1880s onward, there was the Scramble for Africa, which with it brought this desire to establish more direct control, because there needed to be established interior borders between the colonies. There was this competition going on, and this brought with it, which in the Netherlands we call ethische politiek, ethical politics, and the sort of general perspective of Europeans at the time was that it was our task to elevate the other peoples of the world to our level. It's, for example, Rudyard Kipling's poem "The White Man's Burden" is what that's all about. And that was sort of what happened. So churches were established, schools were established. Rather than just leaving the local populations alone and trading with them, there was now a direct administrative rule was established, and there was the strong pressure to evangelize among the populations, to make them Christian. This also happened in Dutch Indonesia, where many wars were started to be fought to establish more direct control. And well, I'll carry on first with the history before talking more about the administrative system. But no, basically that colonialism, as the phenomenon that we understand it today, basically was from 1880 till the end of the Second World War. It's when the real direct establishment, direct rule of colonies happened. Before then, there were trade posts and there were deals with local populations, but there was very little direct control over the interior. And this is in Africa and in Asia. In South America and North America, of course, there was more of a demographic shift. Really, I wouldn't maybe necessarily call even colonization, because local populations were simply eradicated and replaced in North America, and to an extent in South America as well. And the plantation and slavery system was much more extensive, and there were basically nations built out of nothing there, and there was a process of actual nation building and ethnogenesis going on there. Populations sort of transforming, forming their own identity away from their colonial metropole. So the process in the Americas was very different from the process in Africa and Asia. Anyway, we almost lost the Indies to the British during the Napoleonic Wars. Between 1811 and 1816, the Dutch Indies were under British rule until they were handed back. This is in stark contrast to South Africa, which we also lost during the Napoleonic Wars in 1806, and was never given back by the British, because it was at the time before the Suez Canal. It was a very important in-between post for shipping from India to Europe. The British got away with this because the Netherlands was occupied by the French at the time. The Batavian Republic had been proclaimed, and later Napoleon's brother was put on the throne. So we were considered a co-belligerent with the French, in the opinion of the British. And there was for a time discussion over whether we would even be given back the Indies. But in the end, the balance of power was such that the British could keep South Africa, but not the Indies. So the Indies were handed back and remained under Dutch hands until 1949. To maintain Dutch rule over the Indies, the KNIL was formed in 1814. The KNIL is Koninklijk Nederlands Indisch Leger, the Royal Dutch East Indies Army, which my grandfather served in. There was this whole process of tenuous control meant that the KNIL was pretty much permanently fighting, especially from 1880 onward, of course. But even before then, there were still many regional lords that needed to be brought to heel to accept Dutch trade terms. So, for example, the longest conflict in the Dutch East Indies was the Aceh War, 1873 till 1904, which was the conquest of the island of Aceh, and was fought against the Muslims of Aceh. Aceh. It depends on the. There are several translations of the name. My grandfather didn't serve in that war. He was a little. My grandfather joined the Dutch East Indies Army in the 1930s during the Great Depression, as it was one of the few positions that you could still get as a young man to. Well, there was no work, so you became a soldier, and the only army unit recruiting was the Dutch East Indies Army. That's how he ended up there. The Dutch East Indies Army on the eve of World War II counted about 85,000 troops, of which 28,000 were Indonesians. The Indonesian parts of the Royal Dutch East Indies Army were recruited mainly from Moluccas and from Indos, who are mixed European, mixed Javanese. So ethnically they are sort of a distinct group. Indos, there are around 600,000 people of Indo or partly Indo descent in the Netherlands and Molokkan descent. And they are Christian and have a very... It depends, but the admixture of European is between 10 and 75%. Some Indos, you cannot tell that they have anything but European blood, and with some they look very Javanese, and the European component is barely visible. But they were sort of an in-between class in the Dutch East Indies, and they performed, there were about 1 million of them, I think, by 1920. Of mixed, so Indos of mixed European, mixed Javanese, and they perform a sort of in-between role between the European Dutch administrative class, the military, the governor of the colony, the generals, and the top levels of the bureaucracy, and they would form the middle layers of the bureaucracy and the direct communication down to the native population, the actual local Javanese, Ambonese, Sumatrans, and so on. This was pretty common. The British used Hindus for this in many of their African colonies, and Chinese often performed this sort of role as well in the Anglo and French. Mostly the Anglo colonies. The French didn't really use an in-between group. They were much more authoritarian and threw direct rule down in their colonies. So there are about 600,000 of them still in the Netherlands, and they're generally pretty much more patriotic than many white people, actually. They're overrepresented in the armed forces, and they can usually be found represented in nationalist movements. Both of the leaders of our populist parties have at least partially Indo descent. Both Baudet and Geert Wilders have some Indonesian admixture, Indo admixture. It's probably infinitesimally small because a Indo is himself partially white, at least. So one of the terms we get from this the Dutch East Indies armies is klewang, which is a sort of machete-like sword, which was used by colonial troops, and even it became a term that we used even in European context. In war context, so there would be generals saying, "We'll give them the klewang." During the German invasion of the Netherlands in 1940, there's a quote when the Dutch counterattacked at the what's the line again? The Grebbelinie. It was said that the sergeants shouted, "We'll give him the klewang," and that term is basically derived from Indonesian. There's quite a lot of cultural influence in the Netherlands from the Indonesian period, but I'll get to that later. I'll first talk a little bit about the Second World War and the decolonization wars afterwards. So the Dutch Indies were pretty quickly overrun during the Second World War. There were, like I said, 85,000 troops. The Japanese mobilized easily twice that, and the Dutch army had been cutting in its defense budget up until the Second World War, which explains the pretty poor performance of Dutch troops both in the European theater and against the Japanese. Of the about 400,000 troops fighting against the Germans during the Second World War, there was a half-tank division which was severely under-equipped. Infantry was equipped with World War I equipment and so on. So the fact that we lasted for only 13 days in resistance is not just because the Germans bombed our cities and thus forced the surrender, but also because our troops were simply under-equipped. French military plans actually relied on us to resist for at least a month so that they could link up, and then the 400,000 troops of the Dutch army could be effectively used as an entire army corps. But if you actually read about the Battle of the Guerrilla and so on, you can see that our logistics, our command, our military experience was absolutely woeful. We hit our own troops with our own artillery. Retreating battalions were attacked by our own advancing battalions because there was confusion about communications and who was who. So complete mess, really. So the resistance didn't last very long against the Japanese either. There was some guerrilla warfare during the Japanese occupation from 1940 to 1945. And my grandfather was captured and put in a prisoner of war camp in Korea, as was his wife, and he had in total 11 children. I think 4 had been born during the war, and they were also put in a concentration camp in Java itself. I've never heard from my grandfather really his experiences of the war. From what I can tell, from what my family tells me, he probably had some form of PTSD from the war. He did fight for as long as there was fighting. He was a sergeant major in the cavalry, so he was one of the last captured because there was a guerrilla campaign conducted by the remaining Dutch troops after surrender. But he wasn't executed. He was put in a prisoner of war camp in Korea, like I said. Apparently it was a pretty harsh experience. One of my aunts almost starved to death, and pretty much grandmother and grandfather pretty traumatized. Now the important part relevant to what the king said is that after the Second World War there was an attempt at re-establishment of colonial rule, which we called the Politionele Acties, or police actions, which is pretty much a euphemism, because people the Dutch government wanted to avoid calling it an anti-colonial war or a civil war or anything like that, because that would keep Allied sympathy and domestic sympathy. And this is when the KNIL peaked at 140,000 personnel. These were almost exclusively Dutch because there was a lot of distrust for, of course, the native population, except the Moluccans. The Moluccans still maintained a sizable presence in the Dutch army, or the Dutch colonial army at the time, of about 2 divisions. Now the troops that actually made up the KNIL during the police actions were an odd mixture. They were veterans of the KNIL itself. They were Allied troops, or Dutch troops who had been trained by the Allies to fight against the Germans, which numbered about 1,500, called the Prinses Irene Brigade. And the actually largest component was, of course, conscript. But there's another interesting group, which was quite a lot of the NCOs and the most experienced units had been directly recruited from the Waffen-SS. Now, during the Second World War, between 25,000 and 50,000 Dutch volunteered to serve in the Waffen-SS, which makes it pretty much the largest contingent of foreign volunteers in the SS, the only group bigger being Germans themselves. Now, between several hundred and potentially 15,000 Dutch East Front veterans of the SS were offered a deal. They would regain their Dutch citizenship and not be punished if they would fight in the Dutch army in Indonesia. It's not known quite how many served. In the police actions, it's thought that at least 1,000 Dutch SS served. Some government reports say up to 15,000. It's not really clear. The Catholic Church, which lobbied for the acceptance of Dutch SS veterans in the army, said between 15,000 and 25,000, but exact numbers unsure. Now, the Catholic Church lobbied for restoration of SS veterans in the army because it was an anti-communist crusade. The rebels in Indonesia were communists as much as they were Indonesian nationalists. Although after the war that never really materialized into a real communist regime, there were no ties to the Soviet Union or anything. It basically became an authoritarian state with some socialist policies. Anyway, the NCO cadre of the new Dutch army would be made up of quite a few SS veterans. They were both the best soldiers, because they of course were the most experienced troops, and they were also the ones who probably committed quite a lot of the war crimes that happened. again, research here is somewhat lacking, but there were war crimes, and they actually, the tactics have quite a lot of similarity to Eastern Front anti-partisan tactics that the SS applied. So it's not that unlikely that, basically, considering that a lot of the sergeants and corporals in the army would be SS veterans who knew how to deal with guerrilla tactics from the Eastern Front, basically applied them in Indonesia, which means your troops are ambushed, you execute the nearest village. Anyone, reprisal executions, terror tactics, villages were burned with women and children inside, that sort of thing. My grandfather again served in the police actions as well, and again I have no idea what he exactly did because he refused to ever talk about his experiences of the war. But there were definitely war crimes. Were they all committed by the Waffen-SS? Probably not. That's not really provable. The acceptance of Waffen-SS troops in post-colonial armies to fight in the or post-war armies to fight in the colonies is not actually that exceptional. The French units defending Dien Bien Phu during the Korean War, the biggest battle of the French part of the Vietnam War, I mean, quite a lot were SS veterans, both of the SS Division Charlemagne, so French volunteers, but also quite a lot of former SS men serving in the French Foreign Legion, especially Ukrainians and Baltics and Hungarians and Romanians who couldn't go back home because they would be executed by the new communist regimes, of course, but also a lot of Germans trying to escape war crime trials. So it's said that at Dien Bien Phu the war songs being sung were actually German songs, and that the Viet Cong used German propaganda to urge them to surrender. Now, being, of course, ideological anti-communists, they didn't. And a lot of them would carry on fighting pretty much their entire lives. Some, for example, some veterans of the French Foreign Legion and others joined Otto Skorzeny in Spain, where he kept a mercenary group that did combat contracting for example, the Argentine regime, for Portugal, for Salazar, anti-partisan activities against the Basques and Catalonians in Spain itself. They did operations with the Organisation Armée Secrète in Algeria and so on. Basically, a lot of these more ideologically committed former SS men would be professional anti-communists their entire lives and keep fighting. One example is Lari Torni, who was a Finnish SS soldier, and he ended up dying in the Vietnam War as an American soldier. He was promoted to the rank of captain, and he ended up being, he's the only former SSer who is in Arlington Cemetery, the National Military Cemetery of the USA. So he's buried there. I think his name was Americanized to something like Larry Tormenson or something like that. At any rate, there were a lot of war crimes during the police actions, and militarily we actually did win that war, not just due to terror tactics, but simply because even though Indonesia at the time counted 35 million people, as in any war, only a very small percentage of the population is actually actively engaged, and Indonesia wasn't really unified as an identity against the Dutch. Sumatrans were Sumatran, Moluccans were Molukkan, Javanese were Javanese, and Borneans were Bornean, and so on and so on. There are over 1,000 islands in Indonesia. There was no cohesive Indonesian identity at the time, and I'm not sure you could say that there even is today. Balinese feel more Balinese, Javanese feel more Javanese, and so on. And the focus of power during the Dutch colonial period and today in Indonesia has always been in Java, and from Java the rest is controlled. You could say perhaps that Indonesia to this day is a sort of colonial state where the Dutch colonial power has gone, and now the Javanese maintain colonial power over the rest of the island. Anyway, we won the war with about 100,000 casualties in total, civilian mainly. But the US at the time, in the process of establishing its own hegemonic colonial empire over the entire world, forced us to give them independence and withdraw our troops in 1948. This also happened in British India, of course. In 1949, the British were forced to give up their colonies. The French were forced to give up their colonies. all in service to the American empire, which the Americans prefer to keep their vassals subjected through financial and cultural power, with fairly little direct military intervention and direct administrative control, because that just looks bad. And really, it's more sophisticated to just use debt slavery through the IMF and so on. A good book on this is called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which is someone who worked for American banking, I think for about 30 years, mainly in South Africa or South America and in Africa. And he's semi-leftist, I guess, and he wrote a book about how the American system basically uses, international support to enslave people to them. So they'd give a loan to, for example, some country in Africa, and the proviso is, of course, that they pay the loan back, and at the same time they can only hire American construction companies to do the developments, and only hire American NGOs, and so on, so that all the money eventually flows back into America. And now there is a dependence within the country on American industries that have been established there, and that's basically how Americans maintain control. There's no need to have 100,000 colonial troops anywhere, because, well, most people don't even know that they're colonized by the Americans. This is, of course, with the exception of some newer acquisitions, such as Iraq and Afghanistan, where direct military control is still needed to break the spine of those who are resisting. There was a saying in the 20s and 30s, Indië verloren, rampspoed geboren. And Indonesia was quite big in the cultural zeitgeist of the Netherlands, especially from about the 1910s to the 1950s, 1960s, because Orientalism was, of course, big in Europe generally, and xenophilia, obsession with Japanese culture, Chinese culture, Eastern mysticism, Eastern martial arts, although that happened more post-war. But there was in the zeitgeist a sort of interest in the Orient. You've got, of course, Edward Said's famous work on Orientalism, although he's, of course, mainly a postmodernist, attacking the whole concept and trying to guilt Europeans because they had any respect for other cultures. At any rate, in Dutch culture there were musea and expositions about our India, the Nederlands Indië. How would you translate that? Ons India, our Indies, I guess. Famous advertisements used Indonesian teams. For example, you have the tobacco product called Javaanse Jongens, and there's here in Rotterdam, where I live, there's a reconstruction of a Javanese style building that's now a restaurant, which is basically a large hut with these very particular sort of pointed roofs and so on, thatched pointed roofs. So there was this sort of obsession. You get some of the most famous books from the 1920s and before, which are still taught today in Dutch school today, are about or involve Indonesia in some way. So there's the youth, how do you call that? Young adult literature called Jongens van de Bonte Koe, which is a book about an actual historical captain's log of a ship that was on a trade mission to Indonesia to pick up spices, and it's from the perspective of two cabin boys who go aboard the ship. The ship is sunk, they survive on the islands in Indonesia and eventually return to the Netherlands. It's a semi-historical account, but it's a very, very famous and popular youth book, Jongens van de Bonte Koe. Then one of the standard works that we're still taught in Dutch literature today is Max Havelaar by Multatuli, which is a social critique of the Dutch colonial system in the 1880s, 1890s, very critical of the sort of vassalage system we had with the local populations. And his book, Max Havelaar, is responsible in many ways to introducing ethical politics into the Dutch administrative system at the time. So, like I said, we used at the time to simply let local lords do whatever, and it was basically feudal aristocracy, theocracy in some places, especially the Muslim islands. For a time, in fact, it was very funny. For a time, the Netherlands was the largest Muslim country in the world, because Indonesia was a Dutch colony, and Indonesia was the largest Muslim country in the world. So up until 1948, you could say the Netherlands was the largest Muslim country in the world. Of course, there was barely a single Muslim in the Netherlands itself. At any rate, the feudal and theocratic local lords were, of course, fairly abusive to their own populations. So this book by Multatuli, he exposes this sort of neglect, and from then on, the Dutch administrative policy is to take a more active role to suppress the local lords, to start building schools, to evangelize, to Christianize, because it's, of course, it's the white man's burden, the Dutch burden, to elevate the Indonesians up to our level. And you could say that to quite an extent there was, now there was, of course, huge progress in all the colonies from the moment that the Europeans started actively investing in them. You know, actively investing in education, building railroads and so on. There's a very long and interesting book about a Belgian colony called Congo by, what's his name? Rijbroek, I think. Yes, Rijbroek, I think. Which is an expose of the Belgian colonial policy in the Congo. And this is, of course, a leftist historian writing. But if you actually look at the figures he gives, the annual increases in production, the annual increases in literature and literacy rates and so on, you have to admit that basically colonial rule did do a lot of good to elevate the population from tribal society into at least semi-modernized levels. And so was the case in Indonesia as well. I don't have quite the exact figures there, but of course, beyond that, economic productivity hugely increased by implementing modern farming techniques and starting to build an industrial base there. Education was especially raised, and it was actually the educated intellectual class of Indos and Javanese, of which I think about 1 million, so there was about 1 million of Indos and some 10 million Javanese, and about 10% of the population were literate by 1920. And it was from this literate sort of semi-middle class and academics that the revolutionary leaders would emerge that would later lead to the decolonization of Indonesia. And they were, of course, communists, because even back then the intellectual class had a sort of communist leaning, although by far not as bad as today. There was simply a minority of communist sympathizers in most education systems, and especially, of course, it's logical for colonially ruled people to be more inclined towards communism than, say, the Western tradition or anything, because, well, communism at the time advocated for anti-colonialism and advocated for freedom and equality of all peoples and so on. Anyway, there was this huge impact on Dutch culture and Dutch thinking at the time. Like I said, movie posters and movies about Indonesia would be made, and advertisements used it, this sort of thematics, architectural influences. The Dutch Shell, for example, was started as the Dutch East Indies oil company. And if you actually go to the old Shell building, I think here in Rotterdam, there's stained glass of Indonesia and these sorts of things. There's these sort of thematics in it. A huge influence, basically during the Belle Epoque up until the 1920s, 1930s, there was this huge artistic influence on our thinking. Some literature influence as well, historical influence on what we wrote about, these sorts of things. Of course, these cultural influences were, of course, among the middle class and the elite more than anything else. And my grandfather, despite living in Indonesia for some 20 years, I think, 15 to 20 years, and having brought up most of his children there was never any real strong artistic. His house was in a European style. He raised his children in European style and so on, Christian and etc. The only influence was culinary mostly. We maintained the tradition of eating rijsttafel at events and so on, and similar things to that. But it's very much this sort of elitist, salon socialist idea of cultural appropriation, where you take some nice parts that are nice and exotic, and you think, oh, that's really nice, and we'll take that, and we kind of ignore all the brutish sides of the culture, which is what Orientalism really was in general. The French obsession with the Muslims for like in the 1860s, I think, the earlier Orientalism kind of ignored all the barbarism and just represented them as a sort of cultured and exotic folk. Now, in Dutch thinking of today, there's barely any influence on Indonesia anymore. There's no ties with Indonesia, especially no cultural, no economic ties really. There's only the historical. You're still taught about Indonesia in school, but we really don't. It really has no real part in the cultural zeitgeist anymore. Indonesia is just another country. The only factor that still influences our thinking is the fact that there are about 600,000 Indonesian Moluccans here, and like I said, they're quite patriotic, so they don't tend to participate in the grievance industry. They don't tend to advocate for reparations and these sorts of things, like, for example, American blacks do, or other colonial peoples. They don't generally tend to do that. There were a few events in 1971, I believe. A few Moluccan veterans and youths hijacked a train in the north of the country, demanding support from the Dutch government for an independent Moluccan state, which is something we had promised soldiers of Moluccan ethnicity who were fighting in the Dutch East Indies armies during the police actions. We promised them that in return for service we would give them autonomy in their islands, and we kind of broke that promise, and most Moluccans were forced to go back to the Netherlands. Indos as a class were also persecuted. There are basically no Indos left in Indonesia itself. Quite a lot of them moved here or to other countries in the region because, well, they were seen as part of the colonial system by the natives, by the Javanese and so on, and therefore they had very little sympathy from the population, and, well, they basically had no option but to come back with the European rulers to Europe. And that's where most of them are still are, and they're kind of being diluted out as an ethnic population. They existed for about 400 years as a distinct sort of ethnic group of what you could compare to mulattoes, for example, in South America, where they're in between the Javanese and in between the Europeans. But in Europe, they're mixing out with European populations so much that I know some third and fourth generation Indos with blonde hair and blue eyes, and maybe there's like a little bit more of an Asiatic look to their eyes, but there is really no earthly way to tell that they have Indo roots. The older generations, frequently you can see it more. They're short, they're dark skinned and so on. But with the younger generations especially, it's practically impossible to see. Same with Moluccans. They're basically being, as a distinct ethnic group, they're disappearing over time, mixed in with the population here. And the Indo question is always a difficult one in Dutch ethno-nationalist politics because, well, they are not quite non-European because they are between 10 and 75% European, with the median being around 50. So they're not really totally foreign. They are patriotic. They are often very nationalistic. Not ethnically nationalistic, but, you know, civic nationalist, strongly civic nationalist. They serve in the army and so on. They don't tend to grievance monger like many other populations. Although then again, you can wonder if that will stay that way, because of course American cultural influence is pervasive around the world, and perhaps they will start demanding reparations just like every other group, non-white group in the West does, because we've all done something against them sometime, you know. It's always the evil white man has done something to everybody, you know. The Inuit at some point will come over and demand that we pay reparations for having almost exterminated the whales or something like that. But for the time being, you know, they're fairly loyal to the Netherlands and they're not quite a foreign population. So of all the foreign groups, they probably were are the ones who have most claim to stay here as well. But the reparations question has popped up. For example, when the king offered his apologies this week, the reaction by one group, let me look it up here, the ENAR, the European Network Against Racism, which I don't think actually has any Indos in it, and I don't think it represents or speaks for Indonesians or Moluccans. But they said the Dutch king apologized for the colonial past in Indonesia, but only reparations, restitution and introducing measures to address structural racism dating back to colonial ideals can make this meaningful. Yes. You shouldn't apologize. Never apologize. Because if you do, they will sense weakness, and where you give a finger or you stretch out your hand in sympathy, they will grasp it and reach for your wallet or put a knife in your back. You cannot deal with these people in an intellectually honest way because they're not intellectually honest with you. Now, that's not an accusation against Indos or Moluccans, because again, I don't think they're actually represented in this group. And I've never actually heard Indos really complaining about it. The only grievance that is sometimes repeated in Dutch media by Indos is they want reparations for military service in the Dutch colonial army. So veterans basically demanding payouts for military service during the campaigns. And that's okay, that's fairly reasonable. I mean, they did fight for us. We should probably compensate and pay them. We did break our promise with the Moluccans to give them an autonomic state, as unrealistic as it was. I mean, we were never a huge player on the global stage after the 17th century, and we could never have challenged the US empire and asked them to give the Moluccans their own state. And the US wasn't willing to allow us to continue using military force to sort things out in Indonesia the way we wanted to, even though on the ground we were military dominant. So the grievance by the Indonesians themselves about veterans pay, fair enough. But then there are of course all these white liberal people who care more about these issues than the actual affected people themselves, who go on about war crimes and so on. And yes, there definitely were war crimes. Like I said, there were a lot of Waffen-SS serving in Indonesia who basically applied the learned Eastern Front tactics. And it's just like, oh, you killed one of us, we killed 10 of yours. Doesn't matter who. Nearest village, burn it down. These are effective guerrilla tactics, but, well, yes, they are war crimes, right? And that's pretty much the only way to win guerrilla wars, is to commit war crimes. Because otherwise, trying to keep to the rules of engagement, you're never going to win a war. No modern military has actually won a guerrilla war while maintaining rules of engagement. Americans do commit war crimes. They did in Vietnam, they did in Iraq, they did in Afghanistan. The Soviets committed plenty of war crimes in Afghanistan, but because they still somewhat, for appearance sake, maintain rules of engagement and aren't completely brutal, they lose, because the only way to win a guerrilla war against a population that does not support you is absolute brutality. And well, there's no stomach for that in the West. So I guess those Waffen-SS veterans did what they thought needed to be done to win, and they did win. But yeah, maybe not ethical. And they were war crimes. Now, reparations, I don't know. Mostly I'd say we need to step over what happened in the past. If we want to progress as culture and society, we need to stop with all this guilt. We need to have a positive vision of ourselves and a positive image of ourselves. I'd say yes, those war crimes happened. The past is the past. Let's see what we can do in the future together. Now, a little other note on those Waffen-SS soldiers. A lot of them also went on to fight in Korea. And they were, again, the most experienced cadres in Korea. And it's a bit of a scandal, the fact that these SS were allowed to fight in Dutch service after the war. And it was really more of a question of necessity than any form of sympathy from the government to them or their cause, although to an extent there was some sympathy, because one thing that I read was that generals and so on said, well, the enemy is communism, and these men were brave enough to take up arms against communism before. They're ideological fighters, and they're very good fighters, so there's a measure of respect in there, implied in there. Now my other grandfather, so my maternal grandfather, served in the Dutch colonial army. Like I said, he probably ended up he was a sergeant major in the cavalry, and he probably got some form of PTSD from that. I don't know if he was ever involved in any war crimes or in any direct fighting in the police actions. I think at that time he mainly served in the garrison in Bataviastad, but he did fight against the Japanese, and probably most of the PTSD he suffered from was from the camps. Again, I don't quite know. He never spoke about his experiences of the war, and the reason I say he probably had PTSD is because the description I get from aunts and uncles and so on is that, and from my mother, is that he had symptoms that would be consistent with PTSD. Very harsh, very retreated man. Although, of course, he was a military man, so perhaps that had a lot to do with it. Now, my paternal grandfather was a social democrat, and as I said, there was a huge discussion of Indonesia in Dutch politics in the 20s and 30s, and the left segment of politics was for decolonization. The SDAP and the CPN, the Dutch Social Democratic Party and the Dutch Communist Party, constantly advocated for decolonization. And if you look at political elections of the time, a frequent topic was actually whether or not, well, for example, the VVD and the right parties, the ARP, would argue constantly that, oh, well, we can't let these social democrats co-rule with us because they'd, give up Indonesia, and we have a duty to the Indonesian people and to guarantee their prosperity, and of course socialists will destroy their prosperity and so on. So my paternal grandfather refused to be conscripted, and for that reason he had to serve in another military capacity, and he became a douanier, a border guard, and that's kind of how he ended up in his career. So in a way, both of my sides of my family were affected by Indonesia. One very much directly and one much more indirectly in the choice of his career. But Indonesia, again, as a topic, it's basically dead. And the king should be ashamed for apologizing for such things. The past is the past. Let's leave it behind us.